Hello and welcome. I'm Georgina Wright from the Institute for Government's Brexit team. Though this morning we will not be talking about Brexit. In 4 days' time, Americans will go to the polls to elect their new president. More than 69 million citizens have already cast their vote. Many key states, like Texas and Florida, have seen record turnout already. The stakes are high, and the outcome will have an impact not only on the US, but also on its relationships with countries around the world. In this event, we will be looking more closely at what the election and the result of the election will mean for the UK. To discuss all of this, I'm joined by a very distinguished panel. Tobias Ellwood, MP and Chair of the Defence Select Committee, Sophia Gaston, Director of the British Foreign Policy Group, Sir Peter Westmacott, former British Ambassador to the United States and now a Senior Advisor at Chatham House. He also has a book entitled They Call It Diplomacy, published by Head of Zeus, which is coming out in February, so watch out for that. And Dr. Leslie Vinjamuri, Director of the US and Americas Programme and Dean of the Queen Elizabeth II Academy for Leadership in International Affairs at Chatham House. Thank you all very much for being here. Now, before we start, just a few housekeeping rules. This event is being live streamed. There will be a recording available on all our social media platforms after the event, should you wish to watch this all over again. We will be live tweeting, so please do tweet as well using the hashtag IFGPOTUS2020. And if you'd like to submit a question, please do so in the chat box. We have a Q&A monitor who will make sure that I see all your questions, and I will do my absolute best to ask them all. Now, we have about 55 minutes to really delve into this topic, so let's get the discussion underway, and do keep your questions coming. Before we delve into what this might mean for the UK, I thought it might be helpful to remind our viewers and listeners how the campaign is going at the moment. So Leslie, perhaps I could start with you. How much have foreign affairs been a feature, in your view, in this election?
Thank you, and thank you to all of you for having me, especially to you, Georgie. It's an important conversation. I know that a lot of us are having this conversation, but I'm not sure we can have it enough, to be honest, especially right now. Foreign affairs, as we all know from watching the polling, don't formally rank in this election. We certainly know it from watching the debates, even when there was an effort in the final presidential debate to talk about China or to talk about electoral interference by, China or Iran. To talk about climate change, it's really difficult to get the president or the vice president to stay on message because it's not where Americans' minds are. The dominant concern is the pandemic. It is the economy. It is the recovery. But I think that it's probably not right to say that foreign affairs don't matter because, of course, all of those big issues, whether it's the style of leadership that we are seeing from President Trump, when voters are voting and it's a referendum on him, it's also a referendum on foreign affairs, right? A large part of how people see the president is how he conducts himself overseas. When people say the most important electoral issue is the pandemic, and it is, a lot of that has to do indirectly with huge foreign affairs issues, whether it's how you manage borders, how the relationship with China has been managed. When people say it's about the economy, of course, they're not saying it's about foreign affairs, but Americans know it's in the dialogue now that means it's about trade, it's about China. But the election, if you look at the polling, it's about the climate, it's about the economy, it's about inequality in a very serious way. And that gets embedded in the question of the economy. And it's also very much, as we know, about young voters' issues. And it's about questions of minority and minority status in America, racial minorities in particular. So they look like domestic issues, but I think we shouldn't dismiss how much the big foreign affairs issues are embedded even in those domestic issues.
Thank you very much for that. Tobias, perhaps I can come to you now. Obviously, Leslie mentioned quite a few of those challenges, many of them domestic, but also with like a foreign policy, twing or impact to that. Do you think they're the same for the UK?
Thank you very much indeed for allowing me to join such an esteemed panel. And it is absolutely appropriate that we discuss these matters because Britain, I think, is at an inflection point as to what is our role in the world. What should we be doing given where things are heading. I predict that I can't predict what's going to happen over the next 10 years, but I can predict that it's probably going to be a lot bumpier than the last. And there's a number of changing features that both the United States and Britain really should be working together with and are currently not doing so. We have some legacy issues which are causing, continue to cause concern, instability in places like Libya, in the Sahel, Iraq, Afghanistan, places where we've not really finished off and ensured that democracy can continue, and therefore problems emerge from those, whether it be migration or extremism and so forth. So much to do on that front. Then, of course, we've got this massive geopolitical tilt towards China, something that we've been in denial about over the last couple of years, and perhaps has raised its head because of China's conduct during this pandemic. They are on a mission. It's very clear where they want to go. It's not very clear how the West is going to respond. And that's another aspect of perhaps the last few years. A characteristic is the absence of what the West stands for, what we believe in, what we are willing to fight, what we're willing to stand up and do to protect what we our hard-fought values, which have been around, including the architecture for the last 50 years, but are now seem to be looking rather dated. And then another dimension to this, which is perhaps the changing character of conflict. It's less about terrain now. It's actually more about ownership of data. I fear we're slipping towards a Cold War, in fact, but not with weapon systems building up either side of an iron curtain, but more bypassing direct military conflict and economic harm caused by interference through data manipulation, interference with elections and so forth, causing discourse amongst nations and peoples for the benefit of an adversary. So some really big questions, therefore, for the United States and Britain. And if we look back over the last 4 years, the America First project by the United States, they've really not read the unwritten rules that come with being the United States president, that there is a sense of duty to lead the West. And what we'd be looking for, perhaps, is to re-engage with Britain. And for Britain, I'll put my hand up and say we need to do exactly the same. This integrated review that we're our own study, if you like, of what Britain's place is in the world is very, very timely indeed. So we should be encouraging both of us to recognize that if we don't do it, then the change of this presidency, this opportunity to perhaps readdress some of the challenges around the world will have long-lasting consequences with the geopolitical tilt to the Far East.
Thank you very much for that. And I'm sure these are like some of the issues that we'll come back to later in the discussion, particularly around China, but also how we could work together on the Middle East. Sophia, maybe I can turn to you. You've spent a lot of time looking at voter trends and what they might tell us about voter attitudes and expectations. What do you think the campaign so far has taught us about kind of American voters' expectations, and what do they really care about in your view?
Thank you so much, Georgie. I'm very grateful to the IFG for hosting me here today, and especially amongst such an illustrious panel. I think we do like to think here in the UK that we are very polarized at the moment, but I don't think we can overstate the degree to which polarization has really taken force amongst the United States electorate. And I think that's really important to note, because this is something that is obviously playing out in the election campaign, but also will be weighing on whomever takes power after the elections next week. This is actually quite a significant threat and challenge to governance for the United States moving forward. And I think even just in the foreign policy community, it's important to remember that that does have quite a significant influence on the choices that the United States makes. I think that Leslie's already touched on some of the key issues that are in play. Obviously, we know that the pandemic and the economy is very prominent. We've also got these incredibly powerful racial injustice movements. We've also got the sort of other side of that, which is around law and order. And I think there's also something quite potent around the machinery of America's democracy, which is, you know, these questions around the Supreme Court, gerrymandering, DC statehood, and so on. So I think these are all quite powerful. The important thing to note is that with an environment of polarization. I think the choice does feel especially existential. We're seeing that flow into some of the extraordinary early voting figures that are coming through. We've just seen 80 million Americans have now cast a vote, which is quite extraordinary. But I think also, just to pick up on something that Leslie also mentioned, I do think with regards to foreign policy, it's not necessarily at the forefront of people's minds, but I do think it has a really diffuse effect in the election. You know, one of the clearest trends when we look at public opinion about the US from Britain's and other allied partners is just the really shocking degree to which America's standing in the world has declined in the opinions of citizens around the world. I mean, even our research that we've been doing at the BFPG, just 28% of Britons now trust America to act as a responsible nation in the world. And I think that this might be an area in which this America First project has stumbled a little bit, because I think that the American people do like the idea of national prestige, and I think while it obviously tapped into a sense of America being a leader and perhaps a stronger focus on domestic priorities, I think that actually the idea of being a leader amongst friends was very important. And I think that the American people are a little bit conscious of feeling as though they're standing alone at the moment. So I think at the end of the day, the message that Biden is trying to push is not dissimilar to the message we had from the Johnson team in the election at the end of last year, which is a push for return to normalcy, that people want to take the heat out of the conversation. The one complicating thing about that, of course, is that we had a revolution in 2016 election that was really about sort of pushing against the status quo. So I think Biden has to somehow be able to promote both comfort and also make sure that he's making clear that it does not mean a return back to the settlement that people rejected 4 years ago.
Thank you very much for that. And I think we'll come back as well to sort of some of the differences between, you know, what a President Trump would look like again, second term, and President Biden. But before we do so, Sir Peter, you know, governments around the world are obviously waiting with anticipation, and this will be a really busy time at the British Embassy in Washington. You know, how, in your experience, how would the government typically prepare for this? And in your view, and this is a bit of a cheeky question, do you think the government now is prepared for whatever comes next?
Thanks for the nice, easy question, Georgie, and very good to be with you all. You know, when you're a diplomat abroad, election year, especially in the United States, is the kind of fun time. That's when there are really interesting things to do. You go out on the campaign trail, you attend some of the rallies, you go to the conventions, you chat to the candidates, you get a feel for what's going on, partly because the government you're representing back home wants to know, and partly because you've got to be ready for whoever wins to hit the ground running and get the relationship functioning in order to defend your own national interest. And if you think back a little bit to 1992 and Bill Clinton, for example, there was Jonathan Powell, who was the first secretary in our political section, running around, spending almost a year with the Clinton team. And then a couple of years later, he was Tony Blair's chief of staff. So I think, you know, the relationships built during that period made a lot of difference. And even if you're not going to leave civil service and become a political person, those relationships that you can create during campaign time are extremely important. But this year is completely different because we've got COVID. We have got all sorts of problems with the normal events that are not going to take place as they used to. I remember that when Mitt Romney was running against President Obama in early November, in other words, closer to the election than we are now, there was I in his battle bus with candidate Romney and Paul Ryan, his vice president running mate, drinking a coffee before he went on stage for his final rally and just talking about the prospects and, you know, working together if he won, and if he didn't, well, you know, see you around kind of thing. So we were engaged in a way that it's very difficult now. We got a fabulous ambassador in Washington in Karen Pierce, but I know that it is not as easy to go and do all those things now as it used to be. And the second problem, of course, is that whereas the incumbent is a known quantity and you don't have to spend quite the same amount of time getting to know people, with the challenger, at this occasion, you have got Team Biden with a lot of people around him who foreign governments, including ours, I like to think especially ours, know very well from the time when they worked in the Obama team, but they have got a self-denying ordinance at the moment, which is that they must not engage with other governments and representatives of other governments because they don't want to be accused by Trump of somehow having sold out to or being part of some foreign conspiracy to do him down. Actually, the Trump team, before they took office, were busy undermining the Obama administration and busy trying to make other governments change their policies even before they'd taken office. But that's kind of history. But now, because of the toxic nature of this campaign, and because it's a campaign like no other, it isn't quite like that. So it's quite difficult. And I suppose the third point I would say very briefly is that, of course, as everybody's read ad infinitum in the papers, the last couple of prime ministers here in the United Kingdom have made a point of getting very close to the Trump administration, and that has not gone without notice, if you like, in the Biden team. And so there will be a bit of work to be done in the event that Biden wins. In the event that we get another Trump term, well, it'll be business as usual, and that relationship will continue in the strong basis that that we have seen over the last few years.
Thank you very much for that. I'm reminded when the Japanese government went to the Trump Tower and how the Obama presidency didn't appreciate that because Obama was still president until January. We spoke briefly about sort of the campaign, how it's evolving, and a little bit about the candidates. So Peter, maybe I can stay with you building on your remarks just now about sort of Biden and his team and what they think of the government. What do you think a Biden win would mean for the UK?
Well, the first thing that we would see is a degree of familiarity from those of us who've been around a little while, because as Vice President, Joe Biden was regularly in the United Kingdom. A lot of us got to know him very well. We were used to dealing with him, and the senior members of the Biden-Obama team, many of whom are part of his campaign now, and a number of whom we would expect to see in senior positions in a Biden administration. So there would be, I think, a degree of continuity and familiarity. So that's, I think that is a plus. In terms of relationships, well, as I was just saying, the Vice President, as they call him at the moment, Joe Biden, and a lot of his team have noticed the positioning of the British government in recent years. That's life. They are realistic. There are also people from the president-elect, as he would be, downwards, who have their reservations about Brexit. They didn't think this was a brilliant idea from Americans' point of view. They didn't think it was very good for Europe. They didn't think it was very good for the UK. Of course, they're realists. They know that this has happened, but they will be looking at the relationship with the UK in a slightly different way. And of course, they will be looking at Britain in the context of what is their relationship with the European Union and what is the priority that they will be giving to relationships with other major European countries, particularly France and Germany. But of course, because it's Biden who has got strong British roots, but also strong Irish roots, then Ireland will be important as well. And you will have noticed that there was some tweeting both from the Vice President and from members of his team saying, I do hope, I'm putting it politely, I do hope that the internal market bill and the conclusion of the Brexit transition process does not create problems for the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland, because that is something which they care about a lot in Irish America. And thinking back to the 1990s, Biden was one of the 4 very significant Democratic senators who put pressure on President Clinton to take what he called the risk for peace and invite Martin McGuinness and Jerry Adams to the White House, not quite over the dead body of John Major, but certainly over the to the consternation of British government officials at the time. So that will be an important part of it. But I think on a lot of the international issues that we care about, there will be very significant and positive business to be conducted with a Biden administration. We may come back to Iran, but Iran was one of the big foreign policy achievements of the Biden-Obama team. We were all involved with it. We were co-signatories. It's something that Donald Trump has torn up. He's now pursuing a policy of maximum pressure. I think there will be a different approach to Iran, although the Iranians themselves can do quite a lot to make that easier to contemplate if they wish to do so. I think there will be more multilateralism. We won't have any talk of America leaving NATO. That will be reassuring for Britain. Tobias will know a lot more about that. It'll be more multilateral rather than unilateral. Of course, he will still have to look after a lot of the, not necessarily America first, but shall we say American national interests, which were behind many of the hot button issues that President Trump touched on and which led to his election. The sense of people being left behind, the sense that free trade isn't actually a rising tide that raises all boats, but that it has been something which has allowed China to eat everybody else's lunch and to have a pretty good ride in terms of special treatment through the WTO, and so on. So he'll have to, of course, think about those things, and organized labor, which is important to the Democratic Party, will be nervous about some aspects of free trade. And on the back of COVID-19, I think you will see America, just like you're seeing the British government, saying we're not too sure about these very long supply chains. What about the resilience of our industry and our businesses? We need to have some of these things made and produced and stored nearer home rather than the other side of the world, where one outbreak of another virus suddenly means that we can no longer produce any of our motor cars or any of our aeroplanes or any of our pharmaceuticals. So it's not quite deglobalization, and it's not quite renationalization, but it's a recalibration of the global economy. And I think Biden would be a part of that. And then on one or two of the other foreign policy issues, like Saudi Arabia and Turkey and so on, countries which Biden knows extremely well. He also knows Xi Jinping extremely well from the day when he was vice president. He spent a lot of time taking him around America. This is a man who's got 40 years of experience of foreign policy and of working with foreign leaders. And I think that can be something on which we can draw, and which the United Kingdom, as we move on from the 4 years of introversion of Brexit and rediscover, I hope, a global mission. I like to think there's a whole series of those foreign policy and global issues, not least climate change, where we're going to be chairing the COP next year, on which we can engage constructively with a Biden administration. So I think it'll be a little bit bumpy ride at the beginning, but lots of potential to do a lot of important things together in the future.
Thank you. That was really comprehensive, and it's triggered quite a few questions actually on sort of the relative importance of the UK to the US. Will we see the US speaking more to Paris and Berlin? We'll come back to that, but also the special relationship and the prospects for a trade deal, which we'll come back to as well. Leslie, maybe I can turn to you about sort of how different would a second Trump administration be for the UK in terms of sort of foreign policy priorities?
Yeah, I mean, I think if President Trump is possible, not because it would be through any kind of popular vote, but because there's a lot of complications with turnout and with the process of voting, and potentially with the process of counting the votes. And we're watching that in a lot of detail right now in states like Pennsylvania, but in a number of states. First of all, if President Trump is reelected, he will take it as validation, regardless what the national numbers might tell him. I think that would be rapidly dismissed. And I think what that means are a couple of things. First of all, on November 4th or November 5th or November 12th, or whenever that decision were to come in, probably sooner rather than later, if it's a Trump reelection, America continues to be in a position where the pandemic, the rate of the spread of the virus is out of control in the vast majority of states, where there is some recovery in terms of growth, and where there is a lot of movement by Pfizer and other companies to get a vaccine. So I think the first implication, and it certainly has significance for the UK, is that the Trump administration will double down on its policy, which is open up the economy, ignore the spread, and go really hard and deep on getting a vaccine. And the second part of that will be vaccine nationalism. America first will be all about getting the vaccine and getting it and doing whatever trade deals, whatever bilateral deals, whatever brokerages the president needs to do with companies and others, states, where, if it becomes relevant, if an Oxford trial comes through and there's a vaccine, doing whatever it takes to get that vaccine for America, because that is really the only strategy that this president has for bringing the pandemic under control. He simply will not commit to social distancing, wearing masks, closing businesses. In fact, I think we will see quite the opposite if the president is reelected. He will go for opening in the most extraordinary way, to the extent that the federal government can actually put pressure on states and deny states resources to force them to open. I think we will see that happen. So vaccine nationalism will be the first really immediate and present global implication that will have effects on the United Kingdom, especially if a vaccine comes out of the Oxford trials. I think, you know, the broader issues when we get there, the president cares a lot about getting a Nobel Peace Prize. And I know that sounds, you know, what we want to talk is about, does he care about a US-UK free trade deal? Does he care about China? Does he care about trade? Absolutely. He will double down on his China agenda. He will double down on his trade agenda, which will be very much about tariffs and bilateralism. And if the US-UK trade deal fits into that and works for America, fine. And if not, I think he'll be very happy to discard it. But I do think that he cares about getting a Nobel Peace Prize. And so the question is, where does he try to get that? And that's really complicated to see, because it's very hard to see how he gets that in North Korea. It's not clear what that would mean for the UK if he did go that direction. Iran might be something that he goes. The more obvious point of direction based on recent developments would be Israel and that part of the Middle East, right? Pursuing that agenda. And there's a big question about, you know, what role does the UK play in that, and what implication does it have? And then the final thing, I think, you know, the president cares a lot about legacy and what comes next. And so I think it wouldn't be very long before we would start to see more of what we've seen in terms of appointing family members and friends and loyalists. But it might take on a different dimension when we're talking about a president who's unconstrained, who can't be reelected, who doesn't really care about the domestic costs that he might suffer for violating any number of norms. So while I think on the domestic front and the foreign front, obviously there are a number of implications, but I would look to the immediate one first, and that's about the handling of the pandemic, borders, the vaccine, etc.
Great, and we've had quite a number of questions as well about, you know, what if Trump loses the election and how he might react and what that would mean for the sort of couple of weeks that follow, and perhaps we could come back to that. Tobias, we've had quite a cheeky question come in, and I feel like I should ask you this one. What do you think is preferable for this government, a Biden or a Trump win?
Maybe it's better I do leave my computer on mute for this particular one. We need, as Sir Peter was indicating then, you know, there is an obligation that we recognise that we need to work with both sides, and at this side of the actual election itself, it would be inappropriate to sort of choose a winner. All I can articulate perhaps is the desire as to how we would want to work with either of them. So Peter would be better placed to answer this, but is there a tendency for a second-termer American president to start thinking, in fact, we just touched on this, those legacy issues? Is there the ability to nudge the president to look at these wider international concerns rather than simply focusing on the domestic? Now, with that in mind, then there is a possibility which would then match, I think, what we've already heard from Joe Biden, who's made a commitment to re-engage with the international circuit, recognize that there are some big issues there that have been left in abeyance. So, in fact, whoever wins, there's an opportunity for Britain. I have to say, Britain itself needs to move up a gear. We've been distracted for the last 2 or 3 years, Brexit and otherwise, and also I think we've simply become risk averse. We've become less energetic and that's afraid to do with the bandwidth, the machine of government in number 10. The integrated review is a real opportunity for us to upgrade our engagement with the international world. I think thanks to people like Sir Peter and all the fantastic diplomats we have, our understanding of the world is second to none. Our reach, our respect, our appreciation of what's going on, and the thought leadership that we give to America arguably is the best in the world. That's why we have this special relationship. What we're seeing, though, operationally, is us being perhaps overtaken by other countries, not a single country, but depending on the areas that you're actually considering. Whether it be the Middle East, it could very well be the UAE. When it comes to Germany, it could very well be Europe, it could very well be Germany or France. Intelligence-wise, absolutely, we're there. So there's a big question as to how we then engage. What I would say, though, is looking back at Donald Trump and then what needs to happen, is there's an awful lot of tactical reaction going on rather than developing strategy. China, you can say, Donald Trump has, during his tenure, has actually made it very clear to the world what China is actually all about. The gloves of Commonwealth. Everybody's no longer looking at them through rose-tinted glasses. But what do we do about it? There isn't really an answer to that. Tariffs really are reactionary. Even us in Hong Kong giving passports to those who live there pre-97 is reactionary. It won't change China's behavior. It won't change China's attitude in the South China Sea, or China's push for gifting 5G around the world, which lures more and more countries into Chinese influence. So some big questions there is how we take the tactical decisions. Even America telling the UK, don't use Huawei. Well, that's all very well, but what is the strategic answer? What's the counterweight to the high-tech solutions that China is putting forward to? NATO was mentioned before. Yes, increase spending to 2%. Trump, I think, managed to encourage countries to do that. But what is NATO's purpose now? And America pulling troops out of Europe, well, that actually sends a difficult message as well. Daesh, tough on Daesh, and chemical weapons attacks in Syria. But again, it was punitive. It was very bespoke, very detailed, not looking at the wider picture. And I think that's the next challenge. And you can only do that collectively. We can only do that on a multilateral approach. And that's what we'd be looking for whoever is in the White House over the next 4 years.
All very important points, and obviously building on what Leslie was saying earlier, it depends on who is in the White House and how they, what they think of multilateralism. We've got quite a number of questions that come in on sort of more specifically looking at the special relationship, what could they do differently, and also on Brexit. So we will come back to those. But before we do, Sophia, you wrote recently that Trump's maverick approach to diplomacy has centered around personal relationships. Now, how important are these sort of leader-to-leader relationships to the special relationship? And, how does number 10 see this? Is it important?
I think they're absolutely integral to the special relationship. And this is not something that has just begun under Trump's leadership. This is something that I think all of us will remember in rather recent history. Those close relations have been quite consequential. I do think that it's important to remember that when we're looking at Trump's term from the UK side of things, and certainly the political dimensions of this, you cannot separate the fact that Trump's term has coincided with the Brexit process and the Brexit referendum, because this has created a political lens, which I think we've been seeing playing out in a number of ways. If you're going to be leaving your largest trading partner, it makes sense that you need to find a rather big new friend to try and fill that gap. So, of course, there's been a sort of political imperative to be pursuing closer relations, to be emphasizing the degree to which a Trump presidency, which we know, was not necessarily what the British people had been hoping for, to securitize them and say, look, I know this guy's a bit unusual, but here's this enormous dividend through these closer relations and how this will benefit our economy. So I think that this dichotomy that's been created about moving away from the European Union and then moving closer to the United States has certainly been a clear political strategy, and it's been helpful for the government to have something that they could really point towards as a dividend. And I think that's also why we've seen them quite happily allowing these ideas of there being an obstacle to a Biden presidency through his sort of views vis-a-vis on the Brexit negotiations and the island peace process and so on. It's been helpful while Trump has been president to allow those concerns to percolate. That said, I think, it's absolutely, I think, number 2 around the degree to which the British public turned rather sour towards the United States under Donald Trump. And certainly we haven't been hearing a huge amount about the free trade agreement over recent weeks. Of course, they weren't able to push that through before things got really into campaigning mode. But I do think that it's absolutely clear if you look at the UK's foreign policy objectives and what the signals we've already received about what will be in the integrated review. A Biden presidency aligns much more closely with our broader strategic objectives. And it is also true that a Trump presidency puts an enormous degree of pressure on the United Kingdom to play a much stronger role in the governance of global institutions and the liberal world order more generally. So there's a huge kind of resource constraint there. But I do think that the one area that will be a little bit complicated is that, and potentially just on a political level, not institutionally, but is that, of course, we know that one of the priorities of Biden's foreign policy platform will be around strengthening transatlantic relations. And as part of that, he will be seeking to encourage a closer relationship between the United Kingdom and the European Union. This is it all goes back to the reasons why Brexit wasn't necessarily viewed especially favorably in Washington. So I think, we know that the priority for at least the rest of this political term with the Global Britain project is a proactive pivot away from the European neighborhood. We know they're going to be trying to direct intellectual firepower and resources towards the Indo-Pacific and so on. So I think just having, potentially President Biden sort of bearing down on us, trying to push for a closer relationship with the European Union at the time could be politically tricky. But I do think on balance, institutionally, it would make sense and actually be somewhat of a relief for the UK's foreign policy objectives with the Global Britain project.
Thank you so much, and we will definitely come back to that, because we've had a number of questions about the UK's position now that it's outside of the EU, what role it will serve to the US, and we will definitely come back to that. I wanted to focus now briefly on sort of the special relationship. So both countries have had a lot going on over the past 4 years, but the special relationship so far appears to be going strong. We did get an intervention very early on from Kiffer Roberts, who says, I'm Canadian. Canada has a strong relationship with the United States. Why is it that the UK's relationship is special? And is it more special than any other relationships that the US has with individual countries? So Peter, maybe I can turn to you. You mentioned areas of mutual interest, how the UK government could work with a President Biden if he's elected. Tobias and Sophia have talked about, the UK needing to be more proactive. What do you think, what does and should the UK really expect from its special relationship? And if I can tag another question is, has that changed since you were ambassador to the United States?
It's a term which is quite difficult to manage, in my view. I didn't like to talk about the special relationship because I thought there was a certain arrogance and exclusivity to the concept, and it annoyed some of our other partners, many of which also think they've got special relationships with America, whether they are France, the oldest ally, whether it's Israel, whether it's Ireland, whether it's Canada next door. There's a lot of countries that have got special relationships. It's a term that was coined very usefully, almost transactionally, by Winston Churchill in the Second World War, and it served a very valuable purpose. It's still out there. There is a special relationship, but I don't like using the term "the." But the reality is that whoever is in the White House, there are some very special aspects to the relationship that we have had. Oddly enough, although the last couple of British governments have made a point of trying to get close to the Trump administration, inviting him to the United Kingdom, state visits and so on, I was very struck by how, despite proclaiming that he was a big supporter of Brexit, when he came to the United Kingdom, he actually made Theresa May's life rather difficult by pointing out some, in his judgment, weaknesses in the package that she was trying to get through the British Parliament in order to secure the withdrawal agreement. So he was a little bit all over the place, if I can put it like that, even though he was saying that he thought Brexit was marvellous. But that was as much because he doesn't like the European Union as because I think he'd worked out that it was good for the United Kingdom. But that was a part of it. In many respects, the relationship was close, and he talked about an alliance, the strongest alliance the world has ever known, which always goes down well in the United Kingdom when he came. But also President Obama used to say something broadly similar when he had visiting prime ministers of the United Kingdom. And all of them, the one thing they've got in common is that they become unbelievably attached to the British royal family. And we saw that with everybody's visits. and with the extraordinarily warm welcome that I used to see the members of the royal family always received from President Obama and so on, and other people in the United States when they went there. But I think on the substance, what do we want from that relationship at the moment? I'm not sure there's a good answer to Tobias's excellent question. What's the legacy if there's another Trump 4 years? He didn't bother to spell out what the program was for 4 more years. It was just, trust me, I'm me, and I'm not Biden, and he's dreadful and sleepy. And America and the world needs 4 more years of me. But it wasn't much more sophisticated than that. So I don't honestly know what the legacy would be. It could be pretty damaging, like withdrawing the United States from NATO, like ensuring that his promise to pull America out of the climate accords really does take effect, because it hasn't taken effect yet. And it could mean a good deal more unilateralism rather than multilateralism, and more America first, and so on. But we don't honestly know. For the United Kingdom, whoever is the president after the 3rd of November, obviously we would like to see a free trade agreement. I'm one of those people who doesn't think that a free trade agreement with America is ever going to come close to making up for the economic damage of leaving the single market customs union. And indeed, the independent analysts have said that over a decade, it might give us 0.2% of additional GDP if there was a comprehensive free trade agreement between Britain and America. But optically, politically, it would be helpful, especially if we're going to leave the European Union without a deal, which means that our trading relationship with most of our allies, partners outside the EU, as well as inside the EU, is going to be pretty significantly damaged. So either way, that would be, I think, a plus, but we should not fool ourselves that it makes a big economic difference. I think that Trump would be happy to go along with that. I think a President Biden would be happy to do as well, but bear in mind that Congress, as we all know, is in charge of trade negotiations, and the fast track authority expires on the 1st of July next year. And so there isn't much time to get it through on the present tram lines, if you like, of free trade negotiations. I think that there will be the same difficult issues on agriculture, on protectionism, on public procurement, on financial services, our dear old friends, beef hormones and chlorine washed chicken. That's going to be there whoever the president is. And those will be difficult to address, but I'm sure that the British government will want to make progress in that area. I think in addition to that, what we will want to do, again, whoever is going to be in the White House, we will want to make the best of the real strengths that we do have in that relationship, the defense, the interoperability, the cybersecurity, the cyber capabilities that both countries have developed, the intelligence cooperation that Tobias and others have mentioned. This is pretty much second to none, and that's not just the former ambassador, giving ourselves a puff. It is world class for once, that part of the relationship. And I think that we will want to make sure that that continues and those remain strengths, not just for the relationship, but I like to think for the safety and prosperity of the world more generally. And then I think I would like to see a slightly more generous approach. I mean, most people in Britain don't know, for example, that Scotch whisky is currently subject to 25% tariff in the United States, and shortbread biscuits and cashmere jumpers, all because of the Boeing Airbus trade dispute, which has been kicking around for the last 15 years and which is frankly exhausted both sides at what we would call in football terms a score draw. Both sides have got something to answer for, but why the rest of our trading relationship has to pay the penalty of that, I don't really know. And it feels a bit discriminatory. That's not the way you treat close allies, with something like 25% tariffs, and indeed steel exports, same sort of thing. So I think a slightly more benevolent approach to some of those controversial issues would be helpful. Of course, Donald Trump is somebody who believes strongly in tariffs and trade wars. He thinks that everything is a balance, everything is zero sum. And I think international trade, in my view, is a little more complex than that. But either way, whoever is going to be there, I think it would be good to have an easier, better oiled trading relationship between the two countries, as well as finding new ways of ensuring that on all the foreign policy issues that we've already touched on, not least China, that there are ways in which Britain and America can work even more effectively together in the future.
Thank you very much for that. And actually, I was going to come back to you later on sort of, Trump and whether his transactional approach meant that actually a trade deal was very difficult to achieve. Leslie, it obviously takes two to tango in any relationship. But there have been some real areas of tension over the past 4 years between both countries on climate change, the Iran deal, Huawei, which was mentioned by Tobias. And one of the things that I pick up on when I talk to colleagues in Washington is, what is the UK's agenda for the US? We want you to tell us what you want. So my question to you really is, what do you think the US expects from the UK?
After the election, I mean, I think, obviously it depends on which way it goes. I think that a Biden administration would absolutely want to work with the UK on security, on the economy, on climate, and ideally, I mean, Biden's plans, whether it's on climate or on the economy, both of which have national but also tremendous global significance, not least for the US and the UK, are quite radical by US standards. They're not, they're not business as normal. There's nothing in there that's business as normal. He will be leading, if he leads, a coalition in his own party that is very, very diverse. And as soon as the gloves are off and President Trump has been defeated, the progressives in Biden's party are not going to let him off the hook, right? So we could be looking at a really, really radical set of policies, progressive policies that move America into a different space in terms of the longer term recovery, and that look to the UK as a critical partner in that. And so I think that, if that happens, it won't be easy in domestic terms. But if that happens, I think the United States will be looking to the United Kingdom to be a partner in a really serious climate agenda that's integrated with the economic recovery, that's focused on jobs and supply chains and all sorts of issues. But I think that, I think that the United States probably would like to see the United Kingdom. I know it's a little bit rich for the Americans to say this, but I think they'd like to see Britain move past the whole Brexit thing, right? And to get the UK back to thinking strategically about its role in the world and its partnership with the United States. It would be good if the United States could kind of get past the Trump thing and the United Kingdom could get past the Brexit thing, and both countries could become a bit more strategic, a little bit more proactive in terms of looking beyond the very narrow, very domestically constrained, very small for several years now. So getting on board a climate agenda, really getting on board the China question in a serious way, and also moving into thinking about, something in the medium term that has to do with Western-based cooperation on providing serious alternatives on things like infrastructure financing across the global South. Ways to get indirect but really serious and important ways. I think that, once we are through the pandemic and have good preventative measures in place for that, and the vaccine issue is kind of managed, and there's some sort of broader recovery, I think that a Biden administration really will want the UK on board as a strategic partner on climate, on China, and on trade, but really thinking very globally, not just US-UK free trade deal. That's really, really important, but it's really quite small relative to the big global issues of the time.
Great, thank you very much for that. Tobias, so Peter mentioned a little bit sort of defence earlier on, and so did you with NATO. There's obviously a strong defence component to the special relationship, though Trump has criticised NATO, but even Obama was quite cautious on sort of military intervention. Do you think the UK and the US will still see eye to eye on defence and what role they should play, regardless of who wins next week?
Yeah, I think this is a really core part of that special relationship, if I can continue to use that term. I'm slightly biased. I was born in New York. I'm a dual national. And it is something that perhaps I would love to see invigorated. It is important. I think Peter actually uses a good term rather than the. It is a special relationship. We should absolutely recognise that the United States has very strong bonds with other nations. But there is something, I think, quite exceptional about the bond that has developed over the last sort of few decades. There's a great statue in Arlington Cemetery of somebody called Field Marshal Sir John Dill. So Peter, you may recognize the name. He was this character that forged that special relationship. He drank a phenomenal amount of whiskey with Dulles and Marshall during the Second World War. And it proved to the Americans that, I go back to the point, that Britain does have a fantastic understanding of the world around us. Where we need to be better at is then turning that into actual practical application. Big challenges ahead of us, as I mentioned, a difficult decade ahead. For me, the biggest is a Sputnik moment, if you like, a recognition of the geopolitical challenge that China presents that we need to counter. They're not going away, but they are advancing a competing ideology, which is going to take us into a very difficult place if we don't work together. And that is something that's going back to the Atlantic Charter. If this was a creation, a product of both the United States and Britain, then other nations joined in on board, and we should be doing exactly that, because we have some of our international architecture, the United Nations and so forth, that needs updating. It needs making relevant for the world we live in today. And that, I think, is something that we must both confront. I'm not hearing the noises, I have to say, on the integrated review that that's where we want to go. It's almost too bold. And I'm not hearing that much from the United States either, but that simply might be because much of the focus is on domestic issues. But from where I sit as chair of the Defence Select Committee, and from speaking to my counterparts in the other numbers and looking to some of the challenges that we faced, for me, that's where I'd like to go. And this special relationship, yes, it's personalities. We see that between Reagan and Thatcher was probably the best illustration, but it's not partisan lines. I think you had JFK and Macmillan. They were on either side of the different aisle. Likewise with Blair, and Bush was mentioned as well. But even if that relationship isn't as cozy as perhaps as we like, it is rubbing shoulders on the diplomatic corridors, on the factory floors, through procurement and the kit, and of course on the battlefield as well. So that's what I'd like to see.
Great, thank you. I realise we're fast running out of time, and I do want to come back to sort of Brexit and sort of the UK's position from 2021. We will come back to that, but before I do, I wanted to ask Sophia, you wrote a report, a fascinating report actually, on sort of UK and China's relationship. In your view, and we've had quite a couple of questions come through on this as well, which president would be better, do you think, for the UK's relationship with China, and in particular sort of Hong Kong and Taiwan?
So I think it's important to note that, the UK has been through a quite significant process over the past 2 years in terms of its shifting its gears on its relations with China, and certainly the institutional view on its relations with China. I think we're actually at a moment of a little bit of crisis internally, because I think it's dawning on everybody the degree to which we have to be very creative and expansive in thinking about, this is not just about securitizing our critical national infrastructure, but also our economic markets. It's also about our higher education sector. It's also about securitizing our democracy. So I think there's a sort of dawning consciousness of the scale of the task at hand. That said, I think it's important to note that in the United States, there is a degree of bipartisanship on the sort of relatively robust position regarding China. I do think there are quite significant distinctions between the approach of another Trump term and a Biden presidency, because I think it'll mainly be about tone, and also in terms of the way in which the UK would seek to influence and contain, if that is the strategy, China's I suppose increasing incursions into its region. But I think there is the area of significant opportunity for cooperation between the UK and the US on China, but we will always be driven by quite significant social environments, and I think this is important to note. In the UK, the China story is a story about foreign policy, global security. There's some dimension of questions about manufacturing and reshoring, manufacturing and supply chain capabilities. In the United States, a lot of the public concern about China is very much tied into the concerns about globalization. And I think that is considerably weaker in the UK environment. So because in the UK, a lot of those concerns have been channeled through our relationship with the European Union. So they're quite distinct social environments, which is going to create different constraints and opportunities for the political leaders when they're thinking about their choices. My sense is that the UK government will seek to try and pursue a kind of third way where we do securitize quite significantly, but we also try and keep some kind of degree of open, pragmatic economic relationship. I think climate change, it's quite clear that we will try and pursue some cooperation around that. And we do, the institutional view here is that it's better to have China at the table. And I think with COP26 and G7 presidency next year, this will be really, we will see a lot more on that. But I do also think this is where the UK will try and lead through cooperation and new alliances. They're sort of being termed flexible alliances, but I think, you know, we'll be hearing a lot more about the D10, we'll be hearing a lot more about CPTPP. So I think, you know, through international cooperation and also through an economic lens, we will seek to engage more in the Asia Pacific region, and I think our presence there will be very much welcomed by not only the United States but also Australia as well, another key security ally.
Thank you very much for that, and I'm glad you brought up the D10 because we had a question from Michael Shaw specifically asking about where that would go. Right, we're fast running out of time, so I'm going to ask our panelists to be short and sweet. I was going to end with who you thought would win, but I won't ask that because that's just cheeky. So I'm going to now focus on sort of Brexit. I have to bring in Brexit and the impact of Brexit. Leslie, in your view, has Brexit damaged the UK's reputation in the US? We heard from Sir Peter, you know, how Biden campaign, some people in Washington, how they've reacted. You said that, you know, the US just wants the UK to move on from this. But President Trump seems to think it's an excellent idea. So has it damaged the UK's reputation?
Of course it has. I mean, you know, I think it's beyond the shadow of doubt. The favorite parlor game, you know, between the United States and the United Kingdom, the Brits say, well, at least we don't have Trump, and the Americans say, well, at least we don't have Brexit. We can get rid of Trump, and you can't get rid of Brexit. I mean, you know, it's gone on for a very long time, and it's you know, it does actually go to a broader point, which is.
I think we might have to come back to you because your connection is a bit dodgy. Oh, the joys of 21st century virtual events. I'll come back to you, Leslie. Tobias, you travel regularly, or at least you did before COVID, to the US. What do your colleagues think in Congress about the UK?
Well, that's a big question, but certainly post-Brexit, I spent a bit of effort reaching out to some of my friends in Congress. I found myself needing to do a lot more of that after the Internal Markets Bill went through and after its second reading. I was really concerned. I was the one that stood up along with other MPs and said, this is not who Britain is. This is not what we stand for. We can't tell the world that we're willing to avoid international law or be willing to breach it, even if there are examples around the world where that's been done in one way or another. What Britain and the United States, what binds us together is actually our defense of international law, is wanting to encourage other countries to raise their game to match ours. So for us to actually lower the bar in this sense, I think would be very dangerous indeed, not least as touched on before. Then there was some concern about the Good Friday Agreement as well. So I was phoning colleagues to say, listen, this is just, it was actually, I think, the wrong bullet point on the sheet of paper that the minister responded to. But maybe you might need to edit that out because I'm not sure I really was aware of that. But it was an accident, and therefore it goes back to as with all of our politics, it's not so much about the event itself, Brexit, it's how you manage that message. I'm actually convinced we will get a deal. If there's anything that's still left over, such as fisheries agreements, it will be parked into the long grass. The dangers of going out, I mean, without a deal are just so significant. And unhelpful for our relationship with Europe, but also elsewhere, that I think they will be avoided. But of course, like all these things, it goes to the wire. But ultimately, it has been a distraction internally as well as internationally as well. And once we can get this behind us onto into a sort of more understandable and clear place, then we can start focusing on these wider issues that we've spent the last hour discussing, and that's so important because right now the bandwidth in number 10 is just overwhelmed, and we don't even have the capacity or space to explore some of these international challenges because we're so focused on these issues, not least the pandemic, which we've hardly even touched on.
Thank you. I now realise that it's 11, so I will turn to you, Sir Peter, perhaps the last word. We've had quite a few questions about this. The UK often, considers itself a bridge between the US and the EU. Do you think this still can be the case from 2021?
I think a bridge in that sense, no. Because we have got Brexit, we've left the European Union legally, and I agree with Tobias. I think in the coming weeks, for all the huffing and puffing and posturing, there will be a not very good deal, but a deal nevertheless, which allows the United Kingdom to finish the rest of its relationship, particularly the trading relationship, with the European Union in some sort of order. But the problem is that we have always mattered in Washington, in part, at least for the last 40 years, because of the influence, because of the clout that we had at the heart of the European Union. And a lot of the best things the European Union has done over the years, which mattered to America, the creation of a single market, which everybody's become more prosperous from, or the enlargement of the EU to protect new democracies after they left this Soviet oppression. A number of good things that happened in the European Union, which were close to American interests, were down to the United Kingdom. Similarly, I think a lot of our European Union partners paid us more attention because the reality was that the United Kingdom was a very serious player in Washington. We had better access than pretty well everybody, not always, and we always had to work on it, and it was always a mistake if you took that for granted. But the fact is that we were serious players in Washington. And so in both directions, both from Europe and from Washington, our positioning as a serious player at the heart of Europe was a part of the clout and the strength and the political importance that we had. That's now gone. So it won't be a bridge because we won't be in the European Union. We're not a bridge to anywhere. We will be on our own, somewhere offshore the European Union, somewhere in the Atlantic, and creating something out of global Britain. I'm still not quite clear what global Britain means, but if you like, developing new relationships, still hanging on to the really important elements of the bilateral relationship with America that we were talking about before. That's not going to go anywhere. And much of that should also mean that we can remain important allies and partners for our European Union friends, though I'm personally disappointed that there's absolutely no consideration of foreign and security policy, structured cooperation with the EU in the current negotiations between London and Brussels. I think that's a mistake, but maybe after all the hullabaloo and the red game is over, we will come back to our senses and restore a degree of importance there. And to the extent that we are part of European security framework, though they won't like the word framework, then we will begin to matter again to Washington in terms of being a European power. But the short answer to your question at the moment, is that bridge still there? No, it's not, because we've left the European Union. And because both for Europeans and for Americans, we do not count to the same extent that we did.
Thank you so much. There are so many questions that came through about, would a President Harris make a difference? Can the UK and US work in new groupings? So Sophia mentioned the D10, but there were other questions on there as well, and specific questions about US foreign policy towards China and North Korea. But unfortunately, this is all we have time for. I'm sure we could have carried on. Leslie, I'm very sorry we couldn't hear your full remarks, and Sophia, I couldn't bring you in for a final word. But thank you so much to my panel for their time today, and thank you to our viewers and listeners for all your questions. It's going to be an exciting couple of days and possibly an exciting couple of weeks, depending on who wins and whether there's any contest, whether the result is contested or not. But for now, thank you very much to my panel, and hope to see you soon.